All right, so let's go ahead and kind of go on from there. So this unit 4, is on the respiratory and the urinary systems. This is my favorite. This is my favorite unit of the class. I really like this unit. I love the respiratory system, and I think that the kidney is just an exceptional organ, and there's just so many cool things about kidneys. You might think that I put them together because they're my two favorites. That's not the case. They actually have a lot in common. And you may not necessarily think that initially, but hopefully by the end of this unit, I'm able to show you what these two organ systems have in common. But I'll give you a little bit of a teaser. The respiratory and the urinary systems both are involved in helping to regulate what's probably one of our most important physiological traits. So we'll talk about those as we kind of get to them. But this is a fun unit. It's a fun one for me to lecture on. I think there's a lot of really relatable stuff in this unit. And then the other thing too is that the kidneys, I remember being where you guys are a long time ago, and I remember learning about the kidney and thinking, man, this organ doesn't make any sense. Like, it does some things that at first glance seem really backwards. I've always thought to myself when I was a student, man, it could be so much simpler. We could just do this instead. But now that I've understood it a little bit better, I've had the time to take to understand it a little bit better. It makes a lot of sense. So hopefully I can explain it in a way that it makes it not so confusing for you, and you can appreciate how cool it is a lot earlier in life, because kidneys are really, really awesome organs. So it should be a fun unit. We should learn a lot of stuff. We'll talk a little bit more about the lab aspect of this unit once we get into lab today, but there's definitely going to be a lot going on. Okay, so on to the respiratory system. Let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the respiratory system. If I were to ask you, not knowing anything else about it other than what you know right now, what the function of the respiratory system is, what would you tell me? Gas exchange. What else? Anything else?
Breathing.
Breathing. Okay. What else? Those two things kind of cover it? Yeah, they kind of cover it? Okay. All right, cool. So I think that those things do cover it pretty well, right? One of the things that often comes to my mind when I think of the respiratory system is I often think about the exchange of oxygen, right? Oxygen, O2. I think about the exchange of oxygen. So when I think about the respiratory system, I think a lot about oxygen. I also think a little bit about how much oxygen we need, right? Our cells have a really high metabolic rate, which is not something that we've had a whole lot of chance to talk about in this class. Time kind of prevents us from having a really good discussion of metabolic rate, but we've talked about it a little bit. And the bottom line is you need a lot of energy to survive. You need to make a lot of ATP to survive, and you need oxygen for that. So you need a lot of oxygen. Gas exchange for smaller organisms is a lot easier because diffusion works pretty well. We've talked a little bit about diffusion already. If you were a single-celled aerobic organism, you would just have that oxygen diffusing into your single-celled body, and your waste would be diffusing out, and all would be right with the world. But we have a much larger assemblage of cells. You're made up of about 75 trillion cells, and we need to get oxygen to all of those cells. We need to get enough oxygen into our body to allow us to do that. So in order to get enough oxygen into our body, we need a really big exchange surface area. Okay? We still are going to rely on diffusion to get oxygen into our blood, but we need a really big exchange surface area to get enough oxygen into our blood to be able to do that. And I'm gonna come back to this number, but I want you to look around the perimeter of this room and just kind of take in for a minute how big this room is. the exchange surface area that you have for exchanging oxygen inside of your lungs, if you were to take it out of your body and iron it out completely flat, would be about as big as this room. Okay? Our bodies are really good at fitting a big surface area into a very small space. I think we've already talked about that as far as capillaries go, right? So we have a huge exchange surface area, but the problem is I can't walk around with a membrane that big and exchange gases, right? Imagine if we're all walking around with giant backpacks the size of this room on our backs trying to exchange gases with our atmosphere, right? That wouldn't work. It wouldn't ever be feasible. You wouldn't be able to go anywhere. You'd have to sit in one place, right? So we have to compress or condense that surface area into a space small enough to carry around with us. And as a result of that, we have our lungs, right? We fit it into our thoracic cavity, which is remarkable that we're able to compress it that small, all right? The other requirement for a respiratory system or a gas exchange organ is that it has to be kept, I'm going to say this word, and I don't like this word, but it has to be kept moist, okay? If respiratory organs dry out, then they don't work as well. Gas exchange works best across a moist membrane. So it has to be kept moist. You and I kind of solve that problem by default because our lungs are internalized. They stay moist all the time. There's really no risk of them drying out, right? But if we look at other organisms with different types of exchange organs, we see that they do run problems, right? Think about fish, for example, right? Fish use exposed respiratory organs in their gills to extract oxygen from the water that they're swimming in. And we know that if those gills dry out, the fish will die, right? That membrane also has to be kept wet at all times. Amphibians are a great example as well, frogs and things like that. They also, they have lungs, but they also do a small amount of gas exchange through their skin as well, as many species do, right? So those respiratory organs, as it were, also have to be kept moist in order to work properly. So we see that that's the case. But all of our respiratory organs, regardless of which organism we look at, need a really big surface area, and then they also need to be kept moist in order to work. The problem is that you and I have a respiratory organ, a very large respiratory organ condensed into a very small space. So we're going to need to generate some pressure to fill it up. So that means we're going to need a pump to sort of fill it up, and we'll talk about that. All right. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the functions of the respiratory system, and then we'll kind of go from there. So there are four kind of overlapping things that we're going to talk about as we talk about the respiratory system. The first one is the ventilation and exchange of air with the atmosphere. So ventilation. Ventilation of the lungs is the first kind of major theme that we're going to talk about. This is the exchange of air between lungs and the atmosphere. And that involves two processes. That involves inhalation and exhalation, right? We have inhalation and we have exhalation. Okay, so we have ventilation, okay? The other thing that we're going to have to do is once we get air into the lungs is we're going to have to exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide between the lungs and the blood, right? We're going to call those respiratory gases. That's our second primary theme of the respiratory system. The third primary theme of the respiratory system that we're going to have is the transport of those respiratory gases in the blood. Transport of those gases in the blood, how do we carry them in the blood? And then we're also going to be talking about the exchange of gases between the blood and the lungs, which is very similar to number 2. Very similar to number 2. We'll probably handle 2 and 4 at the same time because it's a little bit easier to sort of do that. Okay. All right. All right. So what I would like to do, I think today, is I'd like to start to talk about number 1 on our list, which is the ventilation, exchange of air between the lungs and the atmosphere. We'll talk about how we inhale, we'll talk about how we exhale, and then we'll start to talk, probably on Wednesday of next week, we'll probably start to talk about numbers 2, 3, and 4. I want to give a quick recap, though, of something that we had talked about earlier in the semester, which was sort of the composition of our atmosphere. You guys will remember, let me come over here. Is it okay if I erase this board? Yeah. All right. You guys will remember from earlier in the semester, we had talked about our atmosphere and atmospheric gases. So, you know, we obviously can be at the ocean at sea level, right? This is sea level. And then we can come out of the ocean. Okay. You can go up and up, and there's your mountains, kind of like this. The highest place we can go on Earth is Mount Everest, which is significantly above sea level. In fact, it's 29,034 feet above sea level is approximately what we're at, right? And then of course we have the edge of the atmosphere over here. You and I are significantly lower than that. We are somewhere around here at about 800 feet above sea level, so we're significantly lower than Mount Everest's summit. But this is essentially kind of what we have. Okay. So, remind me, if you guys would do so, can you guys remind me what the atmospheric percentage of oxygen is? Do you remember what oxygen percentage is, the air that's around us in our atmosphere? What? So we've got our atmospheric gas. What percentage of the gas that we breathe is oxygen? Remember? About 20.9%, about 21% oxygen. We'll round that to 21 and we'll make it a little bit easier, but we have that, right? Remember that carbon dioxide is significantly lower than that. CO2 is way less than 1% of our atmospheric gas, right? So when I take a breath, I am taking in a breath of air and roughly 21% of the air molecules that flow into my lungs are oxygen. Fewer than 1% of them are CO2. What gas makes up the majority of our atmosphere? Nitrogen, yeah. Nitrogen makes up the majority of our atmosphere. That's what accounts for a lot of what we see, right? I mean, the sky is blue because of nitrogen, because nitrogen gas reflects blue light. So that's because we have that and stuff. We're not going to include that here. We're going to focus primarily on oxygen and CO2, but that's essentially what we have. So. Do you guys remember what atmospheric pressure was at sea level? So you're standing here, right? We're in Riverside, so we're kind of probably right here. And we've got this column of gas. 21% of it is oxygen, less than 1% of it is carbon dioxide, most of it is nitrogen. But we've got this column of gas pushing down on us. Do you guys remember what atmospheric pressure was at sea level? I like 760. It depends on the units, right? It's funny. Physiologists, we obviously tend to stick to our standard units, just like any other field in science. But the one place where we kind of deviate from it is pressure measurements. So we can measure pressure in atmospheres, and if we look at sea level atmospheric pressure, it would be 1 atmosphere. We can also use millimeters of mercury as well, right? So there's a couple of different units that we'll use. But our atmospheric pressure at sea level is 760 millimeters of mercury, or 1 atmosphere. Okay, or 1 atmosphere is what we have. So it just kind of depends, all right? And then does pressure go up or does it go down as you go up in altitude? Like, let's just say that I decide this weekend that I want to go up to Big Bear or something like that. Is my atmospheric pressure going to be lower than it is at sea level, or is it going to be higher? It's going to be lower, right? It decreases as we go up, and that's because that column of gas is just simply smaller. Okay. All right, cool beans. All right, so there's one other thing that I want to do that when we get into respiratory physiology, physiologists also usually use something called partial pressures of gases. If you've had chemistry, you may or may not remember Dalton's law. You know, you had to learn a lot of gas laws in chemistry class, but one of the ones that you had to learn was Dalton's law. Does anybody remember what Dalton's law tells us? Yeah? What does Dalton's law tell us? I know there's a lot. Probably the minute you walked out of your final, you forgot all of your gas laws, right? That's generally the way that it works. Dalton's law tells us that, that's all right, I got you guys. Dalton's law tells us that if we look at the total pressure that a mixture of gases is exerting on something, that it's equal, that total pressure is equal to the proportions of the individual gases. So if we're looking at a total pressure, atmospheric pressure at sea level of 760 millimeters of mercury, oxygen contributes about 21% to that, okay? So we can talk about partial pressures of gases, right? So Dalton's law tells us, for example, that the partial pressure of oxygen, or the PO2, at sea level is uh, 158.9 millimeters of mercury. Okay, 158.9 millimeters of mercury is what the partial pressure of oxygen is at sea level, right? We could do the same thing for nitrogen, right? We could take that 79% nitrogen, calculate its partial pressure, and so on and so forth. But normally, when we talk about these sorts of things, we usually talk about partial pressures of oxygen. If that's a little bit of a wacky variable for you to visualize, you're definitely not alone. It took me a really long time to visualize it, and I still kind of get a little confused. Easiest way to sort of remember what it means is to just think about it like the amount of oxygen that's present. Okay, so it's not oxygen concentration, that's a completely different thing. But for the sake of our discussions in this class, if you want to think about this number as sort of the amount of oxygen that's present, or the oxygen concentration, you can do that. So as this number gets higher, it means that there's more oxygen. As this number gets lower, it means that there's less oxygen. Okay, and that's probably the easiest way to sort of remember it. It's not entirely correct, but it works for a class like this. But almost everything that we're going to talk about, when we start talking about blood gases, we measure everything in PO2 or PCO2, and so we need to start talking in terms of that. Just remember that as that number gets higher, there's more oxygen. As that number gets lower, there's less oxygen. Okay. So Dalton's law tells us about that. What else do we know? Okay, about gases. Gases are funny. They, in a lot of ways, behave like liquids do. If you guys go down the path of wanting to be a respiratory physiologist or something like that, you might need to take a class called fluid dynamics, which is something that engineers also might take, which is looking at the behavior of fluids. Both liquids, like blood, and gases, like air, are considered fluids, and they have a lot of similarities in terms of the way that they behave. There are some differences. We'll talk about some of the differences here in just a second. But one of the things that we saw with blood is that blood always flowed from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure, right? We generated pressure in our heart, and the blood flowed away from the heart into the arteries where the pressure was lower, okay? All liquids, all fluids flow from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure, okay? So air is no different. Air is going to flow from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure, and it's going to become important in just a couple of minutes. And let's talk about pressure since we're at it, okay? This is a major difference between gases and liquids, okay? If I have a glass of water, if I have a glass of water, for example, there's my glass, and I put water in it, I can have a glass that's half full, right? I don't have to fill a glass of water all the way up to the very top. Every time I fill it, I can choose to fill it only half full, okay? Or half empty, depending on how you look at things, right? But I can choose to fill it up half full, okay? So it's possible to have a container of a liquid that's not completely full, okay? By contrast, if I have a sealed container of gas, okay? If I have a sealed container of gas, so this is sealed, i.e. not open to the environment. If I have a sealed container of gas, those gas molecules are going to fill their container completely, okay? All right, they're going to fill their container completely. There's no such thing as a half full container of gas, because they always fill their container completely, okay? But we can talk about the pressure that gas exerts on the walls of its container, right? Because this gas is exerting a pressure on the walls of its container. And Boyle's law tells us a little bit about that. What does Boyle's law tell us about the relationship between the volume of the container of gas and its pressure? Boyle's law tells us that volume is inversely proportional to pressure. So that means as volume goes down, pressure goes up, and vice versa, right? So if I were to take this container, okay, if I were to take this container and make it only half as big, okay, so what I'm doing here is I'm making it half as big, the gas molecules would still fill the container completely. Gas molecules would still fill the container completely, but they would be doing what to the walls of that container? More pressure, right? They'd be exerting more pressure on the walls of the container. Okay? So the pressure would go up because the volume has decreased. Okay? So, you know, you've got your cylinder of helium gas that you're using to fill balloons with or something like that. And you know that when you take your little nozzle and you open the nozzle to fill a balloon, why does gas flow out of the cylinder of gas? Why does it flow out of the cylinder and into the balloon? Because there's what? I heard it. The difference in pressure, right? A pressure gradient. The pressure is greater inside of the cylinder than it is outside of the cylinder, right? So the pressure is higher in here than it is out here. Well, you've been filling balloons for a long time now, getting ready for whatever party it is, and all of a sudden the gas stops coming out of the container, right? Is the container of gas empty? It's not empty, right? It can never be empty. It doesn't happen. Not unless you put a vacuum on it or something like that, but it's not empty. But why is gas stop coming out? Because there's no pressure gradient, right? There's no pressure gradient. So the pressure inside of the tank is equal to the pressure outside of the tank. So when you open that valve, there's no flow of gas, okay? So that's one major difference between gases and liquids, is when I take a glass of water and I dump it out, that glass of water is empty, right? But I can't, unless I put it on a vacuum or something like that, I can't truly empty a container of gas. Now in those gas cylinders, right, which you surely have seen, maybe you've had the chance to use those for one reason or another, we can put a lot of gas in those containers, which is why they're such thick metal, because they're under exceptionally high pressure. When I was in college, a graduate student accidentally knocked over a gas cylinder one day, and it fell over, and when it hit the table on its way down, it didn't have the protective stuff on it, and it knocked the regulator or the cap off of the cylinder of gas. That gas was under so much pressure that it went through 4 walls before it stopped. And we're talking big cinder block walls. You could look and you could see 3 rooms that way because the cylinder of gas took off. Fortunately, nobody was injured, but that's a lot of pressure. It was like a 200-pound bullet flying through the building. Pretty remarkable stuff. We were on the 4th floor of our building too. It's really good that he wasn't on an exterior wall, or else it just would have taken off and would have been flying about 100 feet in the air. So that would have been something. Anyway, pretty remarkable to see what gas under pressure can do. So anyway, we're going to rely on a couple of these gas laws as we kind of go through some of this material, and we'll talk a little bit about how we ventilate our lungs. Okay. All right. So let's go ahead and talk about how we do this. Actually, first thing we need to do is talk a little bit about the anatomy of our lungs. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk a little bit about anatomy of our thoracic cavity and our lungs. So your thoracic cavity is this. Your thoracic cavity is obviously kind of bordered laterally by your ribs, and then inferiorly, of course, it separates your thoracic cavity from your abdominal cavity with this large skeletal muscle sheet called the diaphragm. And your lungs are inside of there. Okay? Your lungs are inside of your thoracic cavity. Talk a little bit more about the anatomy of our lungs today in lab, but this is essentially kind of what we have here. Okay, so we have a situation that kind of looks like that. Okay, so our lungs are sitting inside of our thoracic cavity. We saw in our last unit, of course, how the heart is kind of found in between those. But what can you guys tell me about the structure of the membranes that sort of surrounds our lungs? So we know that the inside of our lungs is open to the environment, right? So we have the inside of our lungs open to the environment here. But what about the outside of the lungs? The space around our lungs on the inside. What type of membrane surrounds the outside of our internal organs? Which one? Sorry, I just can't hear. Serous. Okay. So there we go. Serous membrane. So serous membrane, right? So surrounding our lungs on the outside is a serous membrane. Right? So we've got a serous membrane surrounding the outside of our lungs. So if we were to take a look at this region right here, okay, and kind of blow this up, excuse me, what would we find? Okay. We would find there's our lungs, there's the wall of my thoracic cavity right there. You're going to find ribs in there and stuff like that. These would be your ribs. Okay. This would be muscle and stuff like that in between those. This is obviously the wall of our lung right here. So serous membranes. Tell me what we know about serous membranes. How many of them are there? They always exist in pairs, right? What's the layer of the serous membrane that we find directly on the surface of our lung? It's the visceral layer, right? So this is the visceral layer. And then somewhere up there, this membrane would come over and fold around, and it would come back down on the wall of the rib cage. What's that layer called? The parietal, right? Okay, the parietal layer, right? Remember that we often will name these serous membranes based on the wall, on the organ that they're surrounding. So the one around our heart, for example, we call the pericardium, right? So we have the visceral and the parietal pericardium. In our lungs, we call it the pleural membrane, right? So we have the visceral and the parietal pleura. Okay? So we call it the pleural membrane, or just simply the pleura. So we have these examples of these. Okay. The lung is also largely a hollow space. This is largely an air-filled space. So we have a couple of pressures that we need to talk about, a couple of spaces that we need to talk about when it comes to the lungs. Okay. This is what we often call the intrapulmonary space. Intrapulmonary means within the lung, right? So the intrapulmonary space, okay? And then this space that we see here is what we often call the interpleural space. Okay. Inter means between, right? So between the pleura. Okay. So we have the intrapulmonary space and we have the interpleural space. I know those words kind of sound similar to each other. Detecting a theme in the class, that would probably be it. Lots of words that sound really similar to each other. Sometimes anatomists are unreasonable. But at any rate, this is what we have. So we have to talk, when we talk about how we ventilate the lungs, we need to talk about the intrapulmonary pressure and how it changes as we change the volume of our thoracic cavity. But we also have to talk about the interpleural space. Okay? The interpleural space is always held at what we call a negative pressure. Okay? It's always a little bit slightly less than atmospheric pressure. And it has to be, all right? When we talk about a negative pressure, it's not actually a negative number. Like if we were to measure it, it would be a positive number. But when I talk about a negative pressure, I'm usually talking about something that is like sucking, right? So like when I drink through a straw, for example, I'm creating a negative pressure in my mouth, and then the fluid, the soda or whatever it is that I'm drinking, follows that pressure gradient up the straw into my mouth, okay? Positive pressure would be the opposite. You're looking at two places. One has a greater pressure than the other, and that creates a blowing space. So, you know, if you have a yard blower or something like that, you're thinking about positive pressure in that regard, right? So the lungs are a really airy, sort of loose tissue. We're going to spend some time in lab looking at the lungs. Probably on Wednesday of next week, we'll talk about the lungs. They don't really have a lot of connective tissue in them. So as a result of that, they tend to be pretty airy and light. They tend not to have a whole lot of their own structure. If I were to take a lung out of an organism or something like that and just set it here on my desk right now, you can see that it wouldn't have a whole lot of its own structure. It would just kind of like a big blob, big airy blob on the desk. It wouldn't stand up very well on its own. So we need to help it maintain its shape and its structure within our thoracic cavity. And one of the primary ways in which we do this is by having a negative pressure in this interpleural space. And what that does is it essentially sucks the lung up against the thoracic cavity wall. Okay? So the lung is kind of sucked up against the thoracic cavity wall. It doesn't stand on its own, but it's sucked up against the thoracic cavity wall. If you make the sound, it helps, right? Sucked up against the thoracic cavity wall because of that negative interpleural pressure. Okay. This can become problematic if we break the thoracic cavity wall somehow, right? If you had an accident, for example, if you had a car accident, you accidentally had something puncture the thoracic cavity wall, okay? Something punctures this. What would happen then is this is now an open space, so this pressure would equalize with atmospheric pressure. It's no longer at a negative pressure. What happens? The lung collapses when that occurs, right? Because again, it doesn't stand very well on its own, okay? So what we have to do is we have to seal that hole. We have to reestablish the negative pressure within that space in order to help the lung reinflate. So this interpleural space is always held at a negative pressure. It's not drastically lower than atmospheric, but it's enough to help to keep the lung sucked up against the thoracic cavity wall. Okay. That makes sense? Okay. So what that means is that when we change the volume of our thoracic cavity, we also are going to change the volume of our lung, okay? Because the lung is going to follow whatever the thoracic cavity does. Okay. Another way of saying that is that the lung has no muscles in it, right? You can't control your lung, but your thoracic cavity is lined completely with skeletal muscle. You can control your thoracic cavity, okay? So when we change the volume of our thoracic cavity, we change the volume of our lungs because they are sucked up against one another. Okay. So let's look, with the few minutes that we have left, let's look at how we ventilate our lungs. So again, here's my thoracic cavity. Right, so I've got my intercostal muscles here, I've got my diaphragm right here, and then I've got my lungs inside of there, right? There we go. Okay, so there's your lungs, okay? So let's go ahead and look at inhalation really quick. With the time that we have left, let's do inhalation, okay? You're gonna take a breath, right? Take a breath for a second. Okay, what are we doing? Okay, when you take a breath, when you inhale, what you're doing is you're contracting your intercostal muscles, okay? So we see that the intercostal muscles are going to move. Let me use a different color. Use them with the lungs. When we inhale, we see that the intercostal muscles are going to contract, and they move the ribs up and out, okay? So the rib cage moves up and out. And then we also are going to see that the diaphragm contracts. It's kind of wacky. The diaphragm moves inferiorly. It goes down. And it doesn't move a lot. It only moves down about 2 centimeters or so. So only about that far. But the diaphragm contracts inferiorly. About 1 to 2 centimeters. Okay, so it doesn't move very far, only about 1 to 2 centimeters. Okay. But what that does is it changes the volume of our thoracic cavity. Okay, so we go from a situation that looks like that to a situation that looks like this. I'm gonna really exaggerate this just for purposes of our drawing here. Obviously, it's greatly exaggerated, but you notice how the volume got bigger, right? And because the lungs are attached to the wall of the thoracic cavity by that negative intrapleural pressure, it also gets bigger, right? So our lungs have also now increased in size. Right? So we see a big change. And again, I drew my drawing exaggerated on purpose, right? So we can see the difference there. But we notice that we have a volume change, right? So if we look at volume between here and here, okay, we see that there's an increase in volume. Okay. Now your lungs, the inside of your lungs, that intrapulmonary space, is open to the environment, and we said that the space always has air molecules in it, so we have that. But now I've taken those air molecules in that container and I've put them in suddenly a much larger container, right? Do you guys see that? Same number of molecules in a much larger container. So what happens to the pressure inside of that container? What does Boyle's law tell us? It means that it goes down, right? Putting the same number of molecules in a bigger container means that the pressure goes down. So comparatively, we see a decrease in pressure, and specifically a decrease in pressure compared to atmospheric. Because remember, this space is open to the environment. So a decrease in pressure compared to atmospheric. So now we're looking at a smaller pressure in here. We're looking at now a comparatively larger pressure out here. Do I have a pressure gradient? Yes. Yes, I do have a pressure gradient. And gas flows from an area of high pressure to low pressure. So what's going to happen? Gas is going to flow into your lungs. Gas is going to flow into your lungs, and you're going to fill your lungs with air. Okay. That's all you're doing. You're just increasing the size, and that gas just flows down a pressure gradient. Why does gas stop flowing, right? When I take that breath, why did gas stop flowing into my lungs? Because the pressure gradient went away, right? The pressure gradient inside of my lungs that intrapulmonary pressure, was now equal to atmospheric, and gas stopped flowing. See how simple that is? I remember when I learned this for the first time, I was like blown away. I was like, man, that is like the simplest thing on the face of the earth, right? Just amazing. Okay. It's just so cool. It's just pressure changes, right? It just relies on a pressure gradient. Okay. We can review this briefly in lab, but real quick, exhalation is the exact same thing in reverse. Okay. So what you do in exhalation is you relax those muscles, you relax your intercostal muscles, you relax your diaphragm. And one of the things that we know about skeletal muscle is that it's not only can contract, it has elastic properties as well, right? And it goes back to its original size when we relax it. So when we exhale, we rely on elastic recoil of the muscles, right? Write that down. When we exhale, we rely on elastic recoil. Relies on elastic recoil of respiratory muscles. And that is going to compress the size of our thoracic cavity. Now we have a lot of air molecules shoved into a very small space. Pressure related to atmospheric pressure goes up, and we see that air flows out of the lungs. Okay? And then when that pressure gradient is eliminated, air stops flowing, and we are back to normal. Now this isn't to say that you can't forcibly exhale air, right? Like you can really push air out of your lungs if you want to. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. But suffice it to say that normal inhalation and exhalation is mostly your intercostal muscles and your diaphragm, and then we see just pressure changes that occur. Okay. All right. Forgot to tell you, this morning I saw the strangest thing on my way to work. I saw a guy on the sidewalk pulling a clam on a leash. Yeah, it was really weird. And I thought to myself, it must be really hard to walk with a cold muscle.